So what is autism? This is a super important question that unfortunately doesn't have a straightforward answer, but I will try my best to explain it here. The biggest hurdle when it comes to explaining autism to people is the general public's view of it as a mental disability. Yes, it is a mental difference and it is a disadvantage over neurotypical people in a lot of aspects, but to label it as a disability provides such a narrow view of what it actually is. When we see a disability, we see a disadvantage on top of an already existing foundation. For example, when you see someone in a wheelchair, you know that their legs intended to work. That was the intended design of their body, but something happened either when they were born or after they were born to disable their legs. Same with someone with depression. Obviously, that's a struggle that ideally wouldn't exist. If we look at the brain as a foundation, the examples I just gave would be a cedar foundation with pine sprinkled all over it to represent depression. The foundation is the brain, the pine on top is the depression. But with autism, the foundation is just fundamentally different. Instead of having a cedar foundation, we have an oak foundation. So it's not like we have autism on top of an already existing neurotypical brain. Our brain is just fundamentally autistic, which explains why there's an autism spectrum. For depression and other mental disabilities, it manifests in everyone in generally the same way. Obviously, I'm simplifying it here, but if you're depressed, you're going to be really sad, etc., etc. But since autism is a fundamental starting point that is just structurally different from a neurotypical brain, one person with autism is not going to be the same as another person with autism, whereas someone who's depressed and another person who's depressed are generally going through the same thing. I think the best way to describe it is like the difference between a male and a female. They are both human, but they have psychological differences that make them act differently. But just because someone is born male or born female, it doesn't mean they're destined to think the exact same way, even though they might have similar traits because of being the same gender. Ironically, I think it would be easier for people to understand autism if we came down from the planet as aliens, because then people would expect a fundamental difference. Technically, if we want to think about it, neurotypical people probably have a spectrum too, but they just call it personality traits and IQ, because their brains were never defined as mental disabilities in the first place. The issue with understanding autism is we are always comparing it to the neurotypical brain, when in reality we are just dealing with something that is fundamentally different, which is why you can't raise every autistic child in the exact same way. Although you can learn from other autistic people, as we do have a lot in common, as neurotypical people have a lot in common with each other, although not enough to get along at times. There is that fundamental understanding that we are all human at the end of the day, and it's similar to when you're dealing with someone who is autistic. So while I do understand a lot of the mindset of an autistic person, being autistic myself, I can't necessarily give advice that would apply to every autistic person on the planet. Whereas someone who deals with depression could probably give advice for depression that would be universally helpful. So what are the main differences between a neurotypical brain and an autistic one? Well, first of all, we have the inability to naturally develop any social skills through just, I guess, growing up. We have to learn socialization as a skill like anybody else would with cooking or fixing a car or using a computer, which in a world that is designed for neurotypical people who can just naturally learn those things and pick up on those things as they grow up, causes us to be developmentally delayed in that area because the world isn't suited for our way of learning. This difficulty with learning to communicate with the world and other people can cause a lot of frustration due to people not knowing how to teach an autistic person, which in turn, through extreme frustration, can cause autistic meltdowns. I feel like that's the most immediately obvious difference between an autistic person and a neurotypical person, but that isn't the only difference, because as I said, we are dealing with a fundamentally different brain. So autism just doesn't mean one thing, it means that everything within the brain works differently. For example, we are able to fixate and look into the finer details of one subject matter very easily, but that can cause us to ignore everything else. This is why you see autistic people be addicted to one thing. Let's say an autistic person is really into Minecraft. They are so into it, so invested, looking into it so much that they start to drown out anything else around them. That's because we have a tendency to look at everything one at a time instead of seeing an overall broad view of stuff. If we have a bunch of information in front of us, we can only look at like one of each thing at a time and focus in on that rather than look at the picture as a whole. Although we are capable of doing that, it just doesn't come naturally. The best visualization of this difference is how an autistic person would decorate their house versus a neurotypical person. Let's say hypothetically there is a neurotypical person and an autistic person. Both of them like weed, video games, and movies. The neurotypical person would have a bunch of weed stuff all over their house, a bunch of video game stuff, and a bunch of movie stuff. Maybe they have Yoda smoking a bong, Sonic spin dashing onto Boba Fett in the form of figurines on a shelf. Stuff like that. The autistic person would have a section for their bong, all their weed stuff, and then they would have a completely separate section for all their Star Wars stuff and a completely separate section for all their video game stuff, and everything would be less mixed together because we compartmentalize each of our different traits and thoughts, and I don't really know how to describe it, but just subjects in our head. This is also why when expressing emotion, autistic people can feel very unempathetic at times. Because in my head, I have a section for happiness, a section for sadness, a section for anger, etc. And at any time I can pull from these sections and feel genuine happiness or feel genuinely sad or get really angry about something. And that doesn't mean the emotions are fake, it just means that they are in different sections of the brain and I can choose when to pull from them at any time. Although when someone makes me angry in the moment, I can't help but just be angry because my emotions take over and I don't necessarily get to choose what part of my brain I want to express. But generally, if I'm in a normal state of mind, I can choose when to express things. But that doesn't mean when I'm expressing anger that I don't also have the happy segment of my brain going. I'm not a robot. If you think about a neurotypical brain, you can think of it as like one straight pipe. The bottom of the pipe is the emotion coming through, and the top of the pipe is expressing it. It's just a linear flow, right up to the top. But for autistic people, halfway through that pipe, we have it branch off into multiple different pipes. And we only have one out for expression, but all of the emotions from different parts of the brain are merging into that one pipe. And we have a valve to just determine which pipe we want to draw from whenever we express. Hopefully that makes sense. I really don't know if it does. Again, I'm autistic. I'm always going to be autistic. So it's hard for me to directly compare my brain to a brain structure I just don't have. But hopefully you learned something in this video, and if you did, be sure to tell me in the comment section below. Last video, there was a lot of very insightful comments that helped me learn more about people's overall experiences with autism other than just my own. So your comments not only help the people who are also looking at the comment section and learning more about autism through you guys, but it also helps me understand how other people are going through life with this condition or living with someone who has autism. Anyways, that's all I wanted to say, so have a nice day.